This is the I Read Comic Books podcast, and we are back from our summer hiatus. Welcome to the show. I'm your host for this week's episode, Paul Jasley. I'm filling in for the marvelous Mike Rappin, but I'm not alone, of course. I'm joined by two great friends to talk about comic books with, Kara Shamborski.
Hey.
And Kait Lamphere.
Hi.
Hi, Kait and Kara. It's good to be back talking with you. I hope the listeners enjoyed the minisodes that we put up the past month, but we're back to the real stuff, back to the real episodes, so it's kind of nice to be back. Speaking of which, since we're back here all together, I need to ask the questions that are most important to our listeners. How have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kait.
I've been great. I discovered Horizon Zero Dawn on the PS4 that my husband has owned for, almost a year at this point, and it's pretty much the only thing I've been doing with my spare time. In terms of comics, I finally picked up Nuclear Winter Volume 2 by Cab, who is Caroline Briault from Canada, and this is published by Boombox, so of course it's a day in the life, very sweet book with some very tender characters that are very close to my heart. Volume 1 really appealed to me because it takes place in the winter, which is actually a nuclear winter that causes all of the characters, all of the residents of this town to look not entirely human. Some of them are green, some of them have 3 arms. And our hero of the book appears to be a healthy person, but you find out a little ways into Volume 1 that's appearances aren't everything. This volume focuses on that character's more mental health. It talks about how she kind of becomes isolated up in this winter town working as a courier on her snowmobile, and how she kind of has isolated herself a little bit and hasn't been talking to her family or her friends very much, and it kind of gets into how, like, the medicine supply, and she has one of these medications, has been interrupted partially because of the weather, but then you find out that the snow biker gang in town has interrupted the flow of medication. So, of course, she has to Scooby it up and go solve this mystery, and in the process, gets kind of more of a hold of her situation, and by the end of the book, everything is fine, and she's hanging out with her friends and her sister, and she calls her mom, and it's just very sweet. I also read Lady Mechanika Sangre number 2 by Joe Benitez with guest artist Brian Ching, and it took me a little while to realize that this was a guest artist, because this artist does so well at having the characters appear like Joe Benitez draws them and colors them. Joe Benitez, I don't believe, colors his own work. But anyway, Lady Mechanika, the main character, she's got a little bit of a rounder face and this really cute bob in this book, and I had to look into this because, like I said, he does such a good job. The art in this book is really great. And this new arc of Lady Mechanika has her in Spain investigating what seems to be a demonic possession of a young man whose dad is convinced that his actions aren't his own, but we find out that this young man is attracted to other young men. So this book, I think, is going to be about diversity and helping his father accept him, but that's just where I hope it goes.
Right.
In the meantime, Lady Mechanika is investigating while all of the young men in this town are getting beheaded. So, a little bit of supernatural, a little bit of mystery, great art.
It sounds appealing. I know that title, Lady Mechanika. I've seen that around a lot, and it seems appealing. I should probably dive into that at some point. So
I have all of it if you would like to borrow it.
Okay, good to know. Cool. How about you, Kara? What have you been reading lately?
What have I been reading, and what have I been up to? Well, first of all, on our summer hiatus, I traveled to a galaxy far, far away, and
that's right.
I went to Disneyland for the first time ever, like the week Galaxy's Edge opened kind of like to the public without a reservation, and it was empty. Like my friend and I were expecting to not be able to even really get to that section of the park, but I think so many people thought that and therefore didn't go. So we literally had all of Star Wars to ourselves. Like, I had an interaction with Rey and Chewbacca and Kylo Ren and got to go to the cantina and rode on the Millennium Falcon twice. And by rode on, I mean piloted, because I got to pilot the Millennium Falcon twice. And let me tell you, friend, you have not lived until you pull that lever to go into hyperspace. Like,
man,
it was a time. So I really, really enjoyed that. I do think if you're thinking about planning a trip there, don't do it if Star Wars is your only destination, because there honestly isn't a lot to do that doesn't cost an extra, like, $200. Like, if you have an extra $200, you can build your own lightsaber. And if you have another extra $200, you can build your own droid. But right now there's, like, one ride. So maybe wait until August when the second ride opens. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, so so this week for comics, I finally read Blackbird Volume 1. That's by Sam Humphries, art by Jen Bartel. And I think this is Jen Bartel's first creator-owned work. And I'm used to seeing her work in, like, covers, and she does all these cute pins, and I don't think I've seen her work in this kind of long-form actual story format. And I gotta tell you, I felt like kind of a snob while reading Blackbird, because yesterday I actually read this, like, whole book about how to write comic books that was written by a professor at SCAD, and they do so many things in Blackbird that this how to write comics book says not to do. So there was a lot of me just being like, So, like, there were, for example, there were a lot of full-length body shots of the characters in this book, which I think works for Jen Bartel's art style, because her style is just this aesthetic. And so by doing these full body shots of all these characters, it's basically Jen Bartel being like, my strength is drawing people who look really cool. And so here's a lot of people who look really cool. But it was because I had just, like, read this book pointing out that that's a thing that's, like, superfluous. Like, a really large part of this book ended up being, like, visually superfluous, because it's all about, like, and here's their fancy clothes. And, like, Sailor Moon did the same thing. So, like, I get it. But also I was just laughing that this was just such a flagrant antithesis of this, like, basically a textbook. So, but okay, so Blackbird is about this 23-year-old girl who's living in LA, and 10 years ago she experienced this trauma, and then her, like, family life fell apart, and her life's kind of a mess, and she's kind of obsessed with this idea that magic is real, and there are real life, like, magic wielders, and she's trying to find them, and she does, but it's not the way she thinks. So, like, it's a really cool concept, and the art is really cool. I just found myself kind of being like, okay, this could have done a little bit differently, some of this plot. And now I've just learned I shouldn't read books about how to make comics, because now I'm just going to overanalyze the comics that I read. But if you like Jen Bartel's aesthetic, definitely read Blackbird if you haven't already. Okay.
Interesting. Yeah, so I guess that was my question when you were talking about the sort of mechanics that you had read about. You found it distracting when they weren't adhering to those rules, or was it more interesting that they weren't doing that? I guess it
just gave me a different framework to think about it. Like, if I had just been reading Blackbird prior to reading this How to Write Comics book, I would have just kind of accepted what was happening. But because I had read a book about how to write comics, and it had a set of guidelines and said, sure, you can break the rules, but understand that there are a certain way of, like, setting these things up. And it basically boiled down to, I don't know if you guys have ever read Strunk and White's The Elements of Style,
of course.
But the main thesis of that work is omit needless words. And that was basically what this comic writing book was also saying, because it is a visual medium and you do need to let the story breathe. So it was interesting to then And it was all about like trusting the artist and if you have certain shots that are relevant to how the story is being perceived, maybe put that in, but basically like trust the artist and let them do what they want to do. So I'm just reading this. I'm like, Jen Bartel really wanted us to see those sneakers she drew. I see. Okay. Which like is fine. But also I was like laughing because I knew what was happening and why it was happening. So it was just a different way of reading comics than I'd done before.
Sure. Yeah. So sometimes peeking behind the curtain can be a little bit too much information, I guess.
For me, yeah. I was like,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
How about you, Paul? What have you been up to?
Well, not much. It's funny. I had a complete and utter phone meltdown last week where my phone completely bricked on me, which meant I spent about 4 days being off the grid, and it was actually kind of refreshing. So I highly recommend maybe doing that. Maybe not doing to the point where you have to like go buy a new phone, but maybe just put it away for a few days and see what the world looks like, outside the screen, I guess. But I'm back. I'm connected. So here I am. In terms of comic books, I've been catching up on a lot of stuff, of course. I recently read the first volume of the Terrifics, Meet the Terrifics. This is the DC series written by Jeff Lemire. The characters were designed by Evan Shaner, and then the book had art by him, Ivan Rice, and Joe Bennett. This was a pretty fun series. It's a lighthearted sort of Silver Age team-up book. You have the wonderful team of Mr. Terrific, Metamorpho, Phantom Girl, and Plastic Man. I mean, that's an all-star lineup for me as a Silver Age DC fan. So, and Lemire has a good way of having the group interact with each other. I think he handles all the different voices of the characters well. Plastic Man is very silly and over the top. Metamorpho is the tough guy with a heart of gold, But it's funny, I was reading this book and I was really enjoying it, and there was I think it was like issue 4 or 5 in this volume where the way it's drawn, it's an issue that Evan Shaner did where the first couple of pages are just 4 panels on each page, and each panel focuses on a different character, and it's page after page of that. So you're kind of getting this character, in separate places. And when it did that, it struck me as like, oh, this is just the Fantastic Four, right? So you have a smart guy, a stretchy guy, a tough guy, and a woman that can turn invisible. So it's like, yeah, it's basically the Fantastic Four, right? It's just that the smart guy isn't stretchy, and you don't have a guy that, can turn into flame. But it's kind of funny. It's like, oh, Terrific's fantastic. It's a nice riff on that dynamic, right, of the Fantastic Four dynamic, which is kind of like baked into a lot of superhero teams. So I enjoyed the Silver Age influence of this. It's hard not to read it as maybe like a dry run for Jeff Lemire's Black Hammer, him trying to do a superhero team book and trying out ideas, but it's a fun, distracting sort of like, Silver Age influenced superhero book. So I really, really enjoyed it. Can't wait to try volume 2 here soon. On the other side of the fence, I guess, I succumbed to the hype and I bought House of X and Powers of X, the number 1 issues of the new X-Men series written by Jonathan Hickman. Art on House of X was by Pepe Larraz, and the art on Powers of X is by R.B. Silva. And it's interesting. I have always been curious about the X-Men, and I guess I felt a duty, since Mike wasn't going to be on this episode, I had to be the one to talk about the X-Men since I was hosting. And it was interesting. I'm glad that I had recently read Ed Piskor's Grand Design book, where he kind of breaks down the history of the X-Men. It's the Cliff Notes version of X-Men history. I've also recently been going back and reading the classic Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum X-Men stuff from the late 70s. So I have a little bit of a background here. So jumping into this, I wasn't completely lost. I really enjoyed House of X number 1 because I felt, even as a sort of a novice X fan, I did feel that Jonathan Hickman was changing the dynamic between humans and mutants. Like, there was a sense of like, this is a brand new status quo. This is something different. It's not the same old feared and hated by a world they're sworn to protect. There's something he introduces that changes the power dynamic between the mutant population and humans in a really interesting way, which I think it makes it worth checking out if you're curious about that stuff. And then on the flip side, I thought the Powers of X number 1 was this sort of big picture, intricately designed story that Hickman is known for and has never really quite worked for me. That issue kind of spans like thousands of years, and it's filling in the background of how the struggle between humans and mutants ended up destroying the planet, but he's filling it in piece by piece, right? So you're getting all these little snippets of information to fill in those gaps. And then in order to do that, Hickman is also putting in like text pages where it's just him doing like a Wikipedia entry of like the history of what happened in the conflict. And those pages really took me out of the book. I really liked the artwork overall in the book, but as soon as it got to a text page, it felt like I was reading a textbook, like a history book. And it's kind of interrupted the flow of the book for me. So I'm on the fence still. I don't know if I'm fully committed or fully transitioned to being an X-Men fan, but I think I'm on board for at least the next 2 issues of these series to see what Hickman has in store. So that has been your X-Men Minute on the I Read Comic Books podcast for this week.
There always has to be one.
Of course, yeah. So cool. So that's the stuff we have been reading. And of course, there's always comic books coming out next week. And comic books come out on, obviously, Wednesday, August 7th this week. And we have books we're excited for. Kara, what are you excited for this week?
Okay, so I don't know if you remember in like the late 2000s, around like 2007, 2008, Dynamite had this whole thing called Project Superpowers where they were like dusting off golden age superheroes that had fallen into public domain and like made them this interconnected team. And I think Alex Ross was doing art for it, so it was like a big deal. And I bought all of it. So, and one of the characters that got their own series as a result of this Project Superpowers thing was the Death-Defying Devil, which they shortened. I say they shortened, but they shortened it to Devil because his full name is Daredevil, but obviously Marvel has the copyright on that for a totally different character. So this Daredevil or apostrophe Devil, I gotta say, I don't remember anything about the backstory. I just remember the costume because it's a pretty wild costume. This dude has like half navy, half red, like just split him down the middle, and it's like a full-on bodysuit. So actually when you think about this whole costume, it's really kind of kinky because like half of it is like half of it's navy, half of it's red, and then he has this belt that has these enormous spikes off of it. Like he would definitely impale his own arm if he ever put his arms down by his side, but whatever. And his weapon is a boomerang. And I'm just like, who designed this?
Yeah.
I did a very brief Wikipedia skim on the character, and I think his first solo title was like Daredevil versus Hitler, and it was just a whole series about this dude wailing on Hitler. So,
sure.
Yeah, Golden Age superheroes, y'all. Anyway, so Death-Defying Devil #1 is out this week from Dynamite, and I'm excited about it because they gave it to Gail Simone, and I love her. So
yeah, okay.
So I'm just kind of like, I saw that and I was just like, this memory sparked of me like about to go off to college and just reading all of these friggin' Dynamite books, and they're rebooting this particular series but with Gail Simone, and I will try anything she writes at least once.
Sure.
So I'm just kind of like, okay, all right. So that's my pick of the week.
I had totally forgotten about Project Superpowers. I remember seeing the books in the store because that's right when I started buying comics again. Was that when that was coming out? I never read them, but I definitely remember this character design because that costume is bonkers.
It is so bonkers. I mean, the whole line was like, it was fine. Like, I feel like Dynamite does books on a level where it's like, if you want to be reading that stuff, you're like super into it. But if it's not your bag, you're just kind of like, eh. But they do have an emphasis on all these kind of like forgotten, pulpy, early golden age heroes. And it's kind of interesting to kind of get into that sometimes. And some of their work is actually pretty interesting. So I am interested to see what happens with this one.
Yeah, especially to have someone like Gail Simone attached. That definitely feels like it could be a sleeper hit of the summer. Maybe we'll see.
Well, yeah, because she's just got this very weird, twisted sense of humor, and she's at a point in her career where I think publishers just let her do what she wants. So I found that over the last 2 decades, her books have gotten progressively weirder as she's gotten a little more, I guess, leverage creatively. So I'm just assuming this book is going to be weird as hell.
Well, that sounds very appealing. I might have to check that out myself. So cool. Kate, what are you excited for
There are 8 Image Firsts re-releasing for $1 this week.
Okay.
What?
So, for the people that might want to check them out, I wanted to list all of them. There's Corpa, Criminal, Gideon Falls, Ice Cream Man, Isola, Oblivion Song, Trees, and Unnatural.
Oh my
and
God,
if you
Trees.
haven't read Trees or Isola, they are some of my favorite books, period. So I recommend checking them out for $1 this week. The ones I'm excited about that I haven't read yet are Unnatural by Mirka and Dolfo. The main character is a pig girl in what sounds like a dystopian society, and it also seems to have been translated from Italian. And I love translated books. I love dystopian settings, and I love the movie Penelope, which stars a pig girl played by Christina Ricci. So everything about this book is calling to me. And then Oblivion Song by Robert Kirkman and Lorenzo De Felici. I've heard about this book from somewhere. I want to say somebody on the Goodreads group was talking about it, and it sounded great, so it's been on my to-read list, and it seems like the perfect time to check it out. It's about Philadelphia has been lost to oblivion, whatever that is, and it's now a hellscape. And then the main character keeps visiting the area looking for something. There's not a whole lot in the description, but I've heard great things. So for $1, I'm going to read it.
And they're re-releasing the first issue of Capra, you said, as well?
Yeah.
Nice.
$1
Get on that,
$1
because that's
number one, yeah.
Wait,
Capra's my jam.
Copra? Do you say Copra? Is it
Copra.
Copra?
I always said Capra. See, this is why you need a
Copra.
pronunciation guide for the book itself.
Oh my
so.
God, that book is wild.
Yeah.
That book was
Yeah,
that's not a book that I would have read. But my former co-host on the Comixologist podcast, Matt Kolowski, was like, you have to read this. And I did. And it's, again, not something I would have picked up on my own, but I don't even want to say anything about it. It's just terrific. Really tight storytelling, clear, weird visuals. If you like comics, you should try Copra.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, it's only
basically,
$1, so.
Gamble $1 on Capra. It's Michelle Pfeiffer. Sorry to hijack your pick, Kate.
No,
but
it's great.
I was going to say, it's basically Michelle Pfeiffer doing an homage to the Suicide Squad series from the 80s. So it's like a team book. But yeah, the visual is what it's all about. His art style is so different and so unique. It's just a stunning comic book. So yeah, if you can grab that first issue for $1, I highly recommend that.
I haven't thought about Trees in the longest time, but that book was incredible.
That's the Ellis book, right? Warren Ellis?
Yeah, it was like super weird. It's basically like these enormous tree-like things fall to Earth. They're extraterrestrial. They just like plant themselves in the ground and they go up like as high as a skyscraper. And they're there for like they're decades, I think, or at least years. And people have no idea what they're there for. So you kind of see like how people are reacting to these weird things cropping up, and all of a sudden stuff starts changing around the trees. So it's kind of just like alien stuff, but in a way we haven't seen it before. So if you like stories that explore what would happen if something fell to Earth and humans are reacting to it, definitely Trees.
Well, I had no idea that they were doing all these images first, so I guess I'm going to have to grab a couple of these if they're only $1. So thanks for the heads up, Kate.
Yeah, for sure.
I am excited this week for Doom Patrol Weight of the Worlds #2. It's good to have the Doom Patrol back. This is the series written by Gerard Way, co-written by Jeremy Lambert, and art on this issue is by James Harvey. Patreon subscribers know that Mike and I recently finished our big reread of the Grant Morrison and Richard Case Doom Patrol series. It's interesting to read that stuff or reread it between volumes of this current Doom Patrol run, because I think initially when Doom Patrol was relaunched by Gerard Way as part of the Young Animal Group imprint at DC, I was like, oh, of course he's going to be mimicking the Grant Morrison stuff. But it was interesting to see just how different his take is of the characters. So this current volume, which is interesting, they launched a new volume, Doom Patrol Weight of the Worlds, even though the first issue of it basically said this is part 13 of the continuing story. So it's not really a good jumping on point. You kind of have to have already read the first volume of this current Doom Patrol to get into it, but I like the way that Way has introduced new characters, and he's been able to sort of strike a nice balance between honoring the past Doom Patrol history and add his own color, own flavor to it. Specifically, the way he handles the character Cliff Steele, who, again, if you've listened to Mike and I talk about Doom Patrol, Cliff Steele, Robot Man, is the greatest comic book character maybe ever. I love that character so much. And on this current volume of Doom Patrol, he was recently turned into a human again. And that first issue of Weight of the Worlds, they really kind of explored maybe that wasn't the best idea, right? Maybe Cliff Steele's identity as Robot Man was so important that him being a human again was actually detrimental to his mental health. And I think that's going to continue as the rest of the series goes on. And I think that's something that I've always liked about the Doom Patrol, and that's something that Gerard Way is really doing on this current volume, is really exploring the character's mental and physical well-being as being a part of a group, and think of the Doom Patrol as a sort of support group instead of just a normal superhero team. That said, the second issue that's coming out on Wednesday, the description I have here says that the Doom Patrol becomes embroiled in the divorce proceedings of feuding cosmic entities. So, of course, with the Doom Patrol, you got to have some weirdness and wildness in there on top of all the heavy emotional baggage. So that's what Gerard Way is bringing to this book, and that's why I love it. So I'm excited for that. So that was our picks for this upcoming week. Our topic for this episode is going to be finding books at the library, or how we find hidden gems, or maybe share some hidden gems we found. So we'll take a quick break and be right back with that discussion. Before we dive into this week's topic, we have a quick announcement to make. If you haven't checked us out on Instagram, do that. We have an Instagram account where we post pictures and stuff over there, obviously. And to entice your engagement on that social media platform, we are doing a Mr. Miracle poster giveaway. Friend of the show, Matt Burbridge, did a great Mr. Miracle poster. He posted up on the Instagram there. And if you like the post, you get entered into the giveaway to win the poster. If you want to find out more, obviously check out our Instagram. And I think we have a link to it here, ircbpodcast.com/giveaway08. You can see the image there, like that, and hopefully win a poster. It's pretty cool. I wish I could win it myself, but obviously as a co-host,
you're not eligible.
I cannot. I'm not eligible, but it's really cool. So yeah, definitely check that out, and check us out on Instagram to find out more. Okay, so like I said, our topic today is all about hidden gems, specifically from your local library, right? We on the show have always talked about the wonderful treasure trove of comics you can find either at your local library physically or digitally through Hoopla. It's one way that I think all of us really engage with comics and have found new stuff. So I thought we would spend today maybe talking about that experience of what attracts your eye, how you find hidden gems, how you find new stuff at the library, and maybe throw out some recommendations for people for books we've enjoyed and we've found that way. So I'll open the floor if anybody has some thoughts on this experience of finding hidden gems at the library.
Ooh, so when I was getting into comic books and graphic novels, prior to being a regular denizen of my local comic shop, the library was where I found everything. Because basically somewhere around like middle school, early high school, the library, like I had like grown up going to the library essentially every week. The librarians knew who I and my family were. And when they realized that I was into graphic novels and comics, the librarians were very kind and showed me where that section was. And whenever they had a new thing, I would be the first to know. And I read basically everything. And so
okay.
like that. So when you're talking about like finding things at the library, that was kind of my first point of entry of being like, oh, there's more to comics than just like Archie comics and the Dennis the Menace issues from the 60s that are still at my grandma's house. And
sure.
And there were a couple really vivid ones I remember from that time. Like, that's how I discovered the book Boneyard. I must have read the first volume of Boneyard like 100 times. It basically, the premise is our protagonist finds out that a relative has died and has left him some land in this in like a little town in the middle of nowhere. So he goes to the town, finds out that the land is a graveyard, and then finds out that the graveyard is haunted by a variety of monsters who are very familiar to all of us, or like riffs on them. So he's kind of realizing that the town knows that the monsters are there, and there's like tension between the town and the monsters, and there's something weird going on with all of it. But basically the town wants to kind of raise the land that the graveyard occupies to make way for like a new development. And so our hero is kind of stuck in the middle of this, and complicating things, at least for him, is the fact that he's kind of got a love interest in the like really cute vampire girl who lives in the graveyard and is trying to like convince him that he needs to keep the graveyard where it is. And again, I read this like 100 times, and when I got older and realized there were more books in the series, I bought like all of them. And like they're not like in my mind as vividly as that first volume, but like that was definitely a librarian pull. There was another book that I read that I don't remember the plot. I don't remember the name, but it scarred me so hard. Like I just have this visual of this comic book where there was like this like blue tentacly alien thing that was like huge, and it lured people in to, I guess, being absorbed by it. Because like on the end of one of its tentacles, it had this creepy little puppet that looked like a white sock puppet with like little red fuzzy hat and arms, and oh my god. And I just, if you know what this book is, don't tell me. I don't want to go back. It really terrified me, but like that was a library find. And I just basically like, once I realized that I could use the library reservation system for stuff, oh my god, I read every single Catwoman trade that was available at that time.
Yeah, that's definitely an important part of the library comic experience. Is once I discovered that my local library, which already had a fantastic comic book section, was a part of the larger Michigan library community where you could actually get books from other libraries delivered to your local one, that opened the floodgates, right? Because suddenly it's like everything's available. It's an amazing resource that you have there at the library. But for me, I always really and still really enjoy the experience of going into their library and actually physically looking at the stacks, right? To actually walk through and find what art catches your eye, right? Because that's really, I think comics are obviously such a visual medium that's the best way for me to do that. Obviously, you can do that at the comic book store, but if you try to read the whole book there, they're going to make you pay for it. Right, obviously, but being able to have a free resource and one that's tailored, I think, libraries, obviously the people there, if there's someone who's working at the library who is a comic book fan, they're going to try to create a unique sort of collection, find different stuff. So I think it's a really nice resource, and I find that experience so satisfying of walking down the aisles and finding a book. It's like, boy, I've never seen that artwork before. Or here's a book by someone I already know, but I didn't know they did. This is an earlier work by them. Like that is such a rewarding experience that I don't think you can really get digitally, right? It's a difference between going to the Blockbuster versus scrolling through Netflix. They're radically different experiences for me. And I think one has engendered better discoveries for me. And that's actually looking at the stuff physically.
No, I think I definitely agree with you, because while thinking about this topic, I realized that going to spaces like that physically was very much part of high school and even college for me. But like once I became an adult, I moved a lot of my library interaction online. I basically use the library to like look up things that I see recommended other places, but it's very rare that I actually go in and browse. It's like for me, my closest library is actually like a long block away from my current workplace. So I'll walk over on my lunch break and pick up books that are reserved for me, but only very occasionally do I wander. But a couple months ago, I wandered upstairs to the graphic novel section, and there's a lot. Like, I forgot that the library that's closest to me is actually kind of the flagship library for the whole county that I'm in. And they have a lot of comics. Like, I was pulling stuff like crazy, and it got to a point where I was like, Kara, there's no way you're going to read 20 comics this week. Like, you have to come down and put some back. But you're right. It is a different experience physically going and browsing, as opposed to just being like, oh, the algorithm on the internet tells me I'll like this book.
Exactly. And I had a similar, sort of experience where I was sort of out of the comics game, so to speak, for a while, having, been a comic book reader and, going to the store a lot when I was in high school and stuff. But after high school, I kind of scaled back on that. So the library was my main source of comics. And I did have that problem of living within walking distance of my library here in Grand Rapids and walking out of the library with like stacks of 5 or 6 comics. I'm like, yeah, there's no way I'm going to be able to read all this stuff. Like these big collections and stuff. It's like you kind of are overwhelmed to the point of like, well, I have to read all of it, right? And so you end up checking out way too many books and hopefully you can get to them before they have to get returned. But I think that, that sort of being there physically is a good way to, like I said, find new art. Like, I think I wouldn't have found Charles Forsman if not for the library. The creator who did The End of the Fucking World and Celebrated Summer. Those books jumped off of not literally, figuratively, jumped off the shelf at me because they stylistically were so unique and so different. Same thing with Lisa Hannawalt. I remember seeing her book, My Dirty Dumb Eyes, at the library and loving it instantly and becoming a huge fan of her work immediately. And it was that I would not have seen it had it not been there on the shelf. I was curious enough to pick it up and flip through it, Well,
Kait, you have a whole lot of books that you have found in your library quest. So how do you start your process of finding a new book to read at the library?
It's mostly an accident. I'll have 1 or 2 books that I put in a request for because I need to read them for the book of the month on Goodreads, or because I've decided that I've waited too long to read a particular book and it's time. But I'll go in and I'll pick up my hold, and then I'll be like, well, I don't have to be home for an hour. I might as well just stay here and browse. So I end up, going home with another 8 or 12 or 15 comic books. There's not a very low limit of what you can check out in a month at my library, as long as it's physical. Hoopla has a very small limit now, but
right.
So, man, I know that you're not supposed to judge books by their cover, but I mostly do. Or if there's a really intriguing title, like the comic book history of beer is one of the ones that jumped out at me.
Well, yeah.
And it's this particular book is a huge book. It's by Jonathan Hennessy, Mike Smith, Aaron McConnell, and Tom Orzechowski, I think is how you'd pronounce it. The full title is The Comic Book Story of Beer, the World's Favorite Beverage from 7000 BC to today's Craft Brewing Revolution. And the book is about as long as the title, and it's exactly what it sounds like. The best part of this book, other than how informative it is that the yeast particles, when it's talking about the science of how beer molecularly is created, the yeast particles are represented by tiny bulldozers. And every segment of history about beer starts with like a little bit of art, a couple panels of art that represent like the art at the time, like the art movements going on, which is just an extra little thing that I really appreciated the artist going into the work to do.
Context.
Yeah. And then when it gets into the science, there's a lot of really helpful diagrams that I really enjoyed. I really need to just buy this book because I'm like, I can't remember now, like at which stage did they separate the mash or whatever it's called? Like I can't even remember, but I'm super interested in the process, and I've got a lot of friends that try to brew beer. So
try.
Yeah. Or try to get around to brewing beer rather time wise, but And so with the craft beer revolution and working in one of the cities that's been named Beer USA or Beer City or whatever, yeah, it's really interesting. And so, yeah, it's long, but anybody who drinks beer or reads comics or both should definitely put in the time to read this one.
Sure.
And that, like I said, that jumped out mostly because of the cover and the title, but it was a really simple cover. Just the text was big and there was like a glass of beer on it. But it was just sitting at my It was just sitting on the shelf at the library. And then that one, I've checked out different branches of the library, and they're all different experiences entirely. I mean, I know that they're all libraries, they're all within the same system, but my local library now, where Brian and I bought our condo at, is really small. It does seem like a satellite version of the library, which is why I'm requesting so many books now, as opposed to just walking in and hope that they have it before I request it. But there's a lot of community events that happen, and all of them, but this one in particular, I feel like it's more focused on kind of bringing people together in the community, even though it doesn't have that many different offerings in terms of catalog or shelf size, versus the library I used to go to had a huge selection of all different genres. It was a much larger location, and it was focused on like the disabled and like some braille books and things like that. It was really interesting. So that's where I found the comic book history of beer, was at this larger branch. But then I walked into another branch over near where I worked, and that was just a totally different experience. It felt like walking into like an industrial place. Like it had like exposed beams and like artistically, like as a choice, and like 2 floors. It was wild. And I picked up the photographic The Life of Graciela Iterbide by Isabel Quintero and Zeke Pina, I think. And I never would have picked this up if the cover wasn't beautiful, if I wasn't just, at the library wasting some time that day. I never would have heard of this photographer. But this book is beautiful. It combines black and white original art with grayscale photography by this woman, Graciela Iterbide. And my very favorite photograph is one where she's taken a picture of this woman who has 5 or 6 iguanas on her head. And the photography and the art are matched with biographic narration and like a poetic analysis of every place that she goes, which is a lot of places. And it's a little bit tragic. I mean, the reason that she kind of set off into the world is because I think that she lost her kid. I can't quite remember, but it all makes the world feel like a more magical place, even if you've been through some really hard experiences. And that one just popped off the shelf. It was a mostly white cover with a really basic piece of art of Graciela Iterbide on the front, and then a large title.
Well, I think that's interesting, because I feel like that those types of books that maybe aren't your sort of typical, what we think of comic book subject matter, right? I think that's the kind of stuff I always like finding at the library, stuff that's a little bit off the beaten path, so to speak. Stuff that you wouldn't find at the local shop, more or less. Yeah, and nonfiction, I mean, I don't really read nonfiction in prose form. It doesn't capture my attention well enough. And then I've tried listening to nonfiction in audiobook form, because I listen to a lot of audiobooks anymore while I'm doing other things. And if you miss something, it's information. You've missed that information. Yeah. And so, but with the comic book, I mean, you're still looking at it, so you can still go back and like reference something that you'd read a few pages earlier, and then you have the artistic representation of whatever it is that it's talking about. So there's just it just grasps me more, so that I'm more likely to remember the information later on.
Yeah. So thinking about, with the physical experience of going to the library, you can see stuff that you wouldn't otherwise see, but Hoopla is, I think, a contrast to that. For those listeners who don't know, Hoopla is an app where, like, you can log in with your library card if your library system has an account with Hoopla, and you can access digital media through this app. And in terms of reading comics, if you have like a bigger screen, it's actually a pretty seamless reading experience, I found. And but Kate's right, they do have limits on how many titles you can borrow. Like for my library system, I think I have a limit of 5 borrows a month. Which some months is too short and some is too long. Like, it's fine if you're checking out 5 graphic novels to read, but if you're trying to read singles, you can read all 5 of those in like an hour and a half, and then you have to wait a whole month. But I noticed the other day while looking on Hoopla, because I normally go in with an idea of what I want to read already, but actually that's how I found Blackbird to read this week, because I just went to the comics tab to just see what they had, and they had like newly added to Hoopla, so I tapped on that, and like basically all of it except for Blackbird on the first few sections was the boys, and I was like, wait, Garth Ennis wrote that a million years ago. What are you oh right, the Amazon series is out now. And so
right, and
then I remembered that actually the last few times I've logged into Hoopla, the first comics that pop up are usually ones that are tied into some kind of new superhero movie release or comic book based property. So I think Hoopla is a really good resource to go to if you want to read something that's tied into some kind of film based on a comic that's been out recently.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So my use of Hoopla has been that sort of experience where I almost look at it as a sort of a resource, where it is something where when Mike and I were doing the Doom Patrol, episodes for Patreon, I have all those issues physically in a long box, but it was much easier for me to just use Hoopla as a way to access it quickly, and read it quickly that way. So it's almost like what's the word I'm looking for? A resource or a reference tool for me when it comes to comics. And it's a really great way to find old stuff. I'm burning through a lot of the old X-Men stuff or that way, because they have all the collections of that stuff there. But yeah, browsing to find new stuff, I think is such a different experience. I've been trying to get better at that on there. If you do the new stuff or, what's trending, it is that sort of algorithm that's saying, well, here's what's popular right now. Here it is. I have found that if you actually go to the specific publisher page, if I go to the DC one, I can scroll through everything that DC's put up there, and it's usually chronological when it's been added. So that's kind of a good way to find stuff too.
Yeah, it's also separated by genre, which is pretty easy for me to just jump to, I know that I like a particular genre, or young adult, or magical, realism fantasy, rather. So I can jump there pretty easily. I did, when I first really got hard into comics a couple of years ago, we had a limit of 9 instead of 4, which it is now, I think. And yeah, so I think I found some more kind of mid-level popularity books, some things that were a little bit older, like Copperhead by Jay Farber and Spire by Cy Spurrier. I read those on there. And again, I think I was attracted to the kind of simple cover design a little bit. It was really easy to see in a thumbnail on Hoopla. And I think I might have actually read Copperhead because it was recommended to me for reading Spire. So it does have a good recommendation system based on things that you've already read or favorited. Mm-hmm.
The algorithm knows you better than you know yourself sometimes, I think is kind of what it comes down to.
Or it knows its own selection better, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I was just thinking of other stuff I've read recently, and there was a book that popped up that I'd heard of, so maybe it wasn't like a hidden gem so much, but when I did find Outer Darkness by John Layman recently on Hoopla with art by Afu Chan, that book I had known the title of, but seeing it there, being able to click on it and read it immediately, that was really like a rewarding experience because I ended up really liking the book a lot. But maybe that's something where the sort of new books on Hoopla algorithm that popped up for me, it was a thing where I've heard of the title, I wanted to check it out, and the sort of seamless ability to start reading it instantly, that's really changed my comic book reading experience in the past few months, is being able to do that through Hoopla.
Yeah, I agree.
I swear we're not paid by Hoopla. This isn't like,
or the library.
I feel like, but exactly. But I do think that, the library for, some people maybe isn't something they really think about when it comes to reading comics. I know, Kara, you talked about your experience discovering comics that way. I grew up similarly going to the library every weekend with my parents. It's always been something I've done, but maybe there's people that don't have that background, and we're kind of saying like the library is a great resource for you to use that way for that.
Well, let me think. When I was in college and just out of college, I feel like I talked to so many people who were like, I just buy everything on Amazon and I just use Kindle, and I'm like, yeah, okay, but that's money, and the library is not that. And your taxes are already paying for the library, so maybe use the library. Like, I think maybe 4 months ago now, I actually had to walk one of my current coworkers she loves reading. She reads like I watch television, and she did not have a library card. And I was like, the library is literally a block away from us. What do you mean you're not using the library? She's like, I don't know. I've just never gone over there. I was like, we're going there at lunch. I marched her over there on our lunch break and like helped guide her through the process of applying for a library card, which is basically like, can you prove that you live in this county? And then she walked out with a library card, and she was happy as a clam. And I'm just like, see, this is the low barrier to entry, and then you're in.
Yeah, it's a tremendous resource, and it's one that's already there, and it's one that I think needs to be used in order to stay around. I think, libraries are cash-strapped. They're not always the highest priority for communities, but so being involved and going to them is definitely an important part of making sure they're going to stay around for a while, and I think luckily things like Hoopla or Canopy, which is a similar app that's just movies you can use your library card to access, are great ways to kind of even make access to the library even easier, right? The hurdle's even lower to get over to find stuff there. So
I find that when I go to the library at different times of the day, it's interesting to see how kind of the demographics of the people using the library changes. Like if I go there, I like going on my lunch break because it's not empty, but it's not busy. And like during the day, it's a lot of like senior citizens who have probably retired. At my library branch, there are a bunch of homeless people who use the library as like a safe space to not be outside. And then like if I go, I try not to go after school because that's when all the families bring their kids, and then it's just like that was at work. I don't need that after work too. But but when I do feel like I have a little more time and it's a little more chill and there's not a whole lot of people there, that's when I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go browse. Okay, let me go check out the comic book section, which, Kate, I don't know if this is the same at your library, but at my library, the comic book section is like sharing an aisle with the knitting section. So
it is.
I was going to say, so my experience with my local library is kind of unique because they do have a section that is just all graphic novels. It's over where they put the movies, the DVDs and stuff, and the compact discs for people that still use those. And they have a whole section that's just comics, but they also have like another, I don't remember what the Dewey Decimal number is, but there's another part of the library that has like the collections of like EC reprints or, like more art books, but there's a lot of comic book stuff in there. They actually put a lot of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko books in that section. So there's still a weird, disconnect between what is in the graphic novel section versus what was traditionally part of the library collection, I think. So in that regard, I try to make a habit of checking out both sections. Like maybe I could find some cool reprints of old EC, Silver Age comics, or some Golden Age stuff that's not going to be thrown in with the sort of more recent graphic novel collection stuff. And that's where I found, like the biography about Jack Kirby, King of Comics. That was in that section. That was a good eye opener for me to kind of learn more about that. I wouldn't have found that stuff normally. The collections of stuff that Steve Ditko did before Marvel, like the really early Steve Ditko stuff that isn't as easily accessible, that's a good place to find that stuff. And I wish I could remember what the Dewey Decimal number was because it's going to bother me. But yeah, so there's not only is the library a great resource, but there's also different sections to check out. So, yeah.
I just found a browser extension called Library. It's just called Library Extension. And if I'm on Goodreads, it will pop up an extra little drop-down menu on Goodreads that tells me whether or not it's available on Hoopla or physically at the library.
What?
And it'll show up. I mean, I mostly use it on Goodreads, but it'll also show up on like BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon and a bunch of other places.
We are living in the future.
Yep, it's the best thing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. So I think, do we have any other maybe sort of recommendations we want to shout out while we're here talking about it?
I mean, my recommendation is please go to the library.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Don't take our word for it. Check it out.
There's so many like smaller independent books or older books that are so great, and they get overlooked because of how much stuff is on the market, which is great. But if you're not browsing, I mean, either at your store or at your library or online, I mean, if you're not just like looking through things, you're never going to find them. So yeah, go to your local library branch and see what they've got that maybe you've never heard of.
And we cannot emphasize this enough, but it is free.
Yeah.
So if you're that comics person who's like, man, I want to read more comics, but my budget doesn't allow for that, friend, get thee to the library.
Right. Especially, we were talking about hidden gems, but, as a resource to do research, the library's importance can't be overstated. If there's classic stuff that you haven't read and you want to check out, I bet your library probably has a pretty solid selection of like Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, or I know my local library, both physically and on Hoopla, has all the Love and Rocket stuff. So stuff that maybe you've backlogged on your to-read eventually pile, check it out at the library and they'll have it for you.
Yeah, and don't forget to check out if you have an interlibrary loan system. Like in Michigan, it's called Melcat, and I can order things that are on the shelf across the state, or at a university that participates in these programs. And don't be afraid to use that. I mean, the only thing that you've got to be careful of is getting it back in time, because I have no idea how their late fees would work when you owe money to Detroit, But
sure, yeah.
It's great. I mean, I've read so many obscure comics just by ordering them and then picking them up at my local branch.
My library actually just, like, as of last month, eliminated late fees.
Yes.
Wow.
Yep, that's great. So did ours.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is there's literally no excuse to not
literally
go to
no
the
excuse to not go to the library. Please go.
We're looking at you, Nick.
Oh, okay. This is great. I think, as I mentioned, it obviously, your local comic book store is an important part of your comic book reading experience, I think, but you shouldn't overlook the sort of the treasure trove of information there at the local library. So, like I said, don't take our word for it. Check it out at the local library, if anyone gets that reference. So I guess we're going to wrap up this conversation. If you have any other recommendations for books you found at the library, or want to correct us on anything, you can follow us on Twitter. We're all over there. Kara is at Kara S. Zam. Kait is at Kait L. Phere, Phere. I am at Ohio Polly, and the show, of course, is at IRCB Podcast. As I mentioned, we are also on Instagram at IRCB Podcast, so find us over there as well.
You can subscribe to us on Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. Without your support, this show wouldn't survive. That sounds really dark, but it is also true. Server fees are a thing. Join now for access to exclusive audio and articles, early access to top of my pile posts, and more. Our Goodreads group, which we mentioned on this show a few times, is a lovely community of comic friends, and we have weekly threads. Check it out at ircbpodcast.com/Goodreads.
You can see our website at ircbpodcast.com, where we have a pronunciation guide.
Whoa.
Like for the word pronunciation. And merchandise. Please remember to rate and review our show on whatever podcatcher you use. That really does help us out. You can email the show with what you've been reading, recipes, corrections, or anything that you have to say at ircbpodcast@gmail.com.
I want to say Infinity Shred is the best band in the world. They also happen to do the music for our show. Xander, he evokes that feeling you get when you gaze up into the sky in the desert and see the Milky Way above you. He's also a wizard who edits the show. I want to thank Mike for letting me host the show this week. I want to thank Kait and Kara for having a great conversation about libraries. And I want to thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. We all do. Until next time, comics are good, and so are you.